Hello, everybody. I'm going to follow on a post that I made earlier this week talking about how the Net Promoter Score is just not enough anymore, and probably never was. Don't get me wrong here. I'm a customer experience guy. I use behavioral science as my tools, and I'm a big supporter of the Net Promoter Score, or NPS. I've just learned that it isn't enough. And today I'm going to talk about, well, really one of the biggest reasons why it's not. And this is a concept called a halo effect. Now, I'm going to get into that in a minute, but let me just spend a little 60 seconds or so talking about Net Promoter Score for those that are maybe a little bit less familiar still with it. So, Net Promoter Score, NPS, is an 11-point scale, 0 to 10, that talks about how likely somebody is to recommend or refer business to that company asking the survey or asking the question. You break it up into 3 segments, into what are called detractors, passives, and promoters, and a great deal of research has been done to talk about how likely each of these groups are to come back, how likely they are to leave the business. NPS has become the de facto customer experience score. It's been probably one of the most transformative programs to have hit the world of customer centricity in 20 years. It is a game changer, but Net Promoter Score is just a first step. For those of you out there who have read the book and had spent some time learning about how these programs are meant to function, there's some pretty telling lines in most of the research that urges businesses not to manage to the score. And there's a lot of reason for that, but in real life, quite often, especially with the teams that are customer facing, that is exactly what happens. You get a board that says, where's your NPS metric? It gets instituted as a tick box type solution. It gets whinnied down throughout the organization and ultimately becomes part of a performance metric that determines bonuses, raises, promotions, commendations, etc. So what ends up happening is you get customer-facing people asking customers to give a good rating because it's going to impact them personally. And this is why you don't want to manage to the score, one of the reasons why you don't want to manage to the score. We're going to end up with answers that are not exactly reflective of how well we really did talking to the business or talking to the customer. Now, just a few other key points here. The Net Promoter Score is what's called an attitudinal survey. It's intention driven. That question, how likely are we to recommend, is frankly subjective, and a number of reasons can influence how the customer responds at any given time. They could have been just tired. There could be survey fatigue because they've been asked too many times. They may give a non-committal answer, or as we'll see, there can be other things at play that mean that score that they give is frankly not objectively correct. So let me talk about a couple of challenges with NPS by itself, keeping in mind I am still a big proponent of this program. It is an excellent first start. First, there's some evidence that NPS has been shown to independently predict retention. Trouble is, there's very little, if any, independent research that proves that NPS is predictive of revenue or profit growth. And that's a big problem. In fact, at the beginning of 2019, most of the great thought leaders in the customer experience domain were sort of ringing the alarm bell that Net Promoter Score and customer experience programs were at risk because, listen, there've been some concerns that if things like NPS can't show demonstrable ROI, why do we invest in them at all? Valid question. Now, let me talk a little bit about one of the more impactful influences to attitudinal surveys like Net Promoter Score, and these are things called halo effects. They're relatively easy to understand. There's some really great literature about them, but the gist of it is this. A company's performance, financial performance, how well it's doing at the time, how many amazing quarters it's had in a row, what kind of good press out there is happening to it, can actually have a pretty substantive opinion or a substantive influence on how well we perceive the company despite the experience we've just gone through. For example, I think I've said it before, I'm a pretty ardent Apple fan. And that's despite me having to have fixed my laptop, I don't know, going on like 8 or 9 times now. I was that lucky guy that got what amounts to a lemon of a MacBook Pro. And yet, I have iPhones and iPads and Apple TVs. And I use iCloud and iTunes. I'm what you'd call loyal, though that might be beginning to change. The point is, if you ask me, had you asked me, not too long ago, how likely was I to recommend Apple, I would have fallen in promoter cat territory. I would have been a 9 or a 10. And the reason for that is a concept called cognitive dissonance. I like Apple. I like them for all kinds of reasons. Their marketing is great, their product design is great, etc., etc. But because of that, I'm likely to give a biased answer without actually intending to do so. But by and large, halo effects are a form of cognitive dissonance where our minds are, often without our awareness, influencing the answers to subjective questions like how likely am I to recommend. So there's a variety of other reasons where other places where halo effects are going to influence the business, and there's some excellent books out there that I'll recommend in the link below. But bottom line, if the only thing that we're using to measure customer loyalty, customer centricity is the Net Promoter Score, chances are we're not going to get the kind of return that we want. We need more. And here's a couple of things that will help. One, find some objective metrics. If your primary business line is an app, measure how many times that user comes back. Try to measure referrals or downloads, campaigns that ask me to, refer to 10 friends. Measure how many people came from me. Rather than just asking me my intention to recommend, try to track in another way to follow up on that. It's a little bit like having a New Year's resolution to lose 10 pounds or 10 kg. We know at the beginning of the year that very few of us are actually going to succeed in that metric. So if we measure it, we'll have a much better idea of how effective our programs are. So an objective measure like that with an app would work well. There are other metrics that would work in retail establishments and banks, things like number of products and usage, time in store, number of times you've returned to the store, this kind of good stuff. Bottom line is this. Net Promoter Score is absolutely biased by things like halo effects. And because of that, we need to do more than simply institute a feedback management program like NPS. It doesn't mean that it's not an amazing first start. It absolutely is one of the most powerful ways to make a business move from being inward focused to being customer centric or outside in organized. So I recommend it, but I caution that it's not enough. If you really want to see positive, strong ROIs come out of customer centricity campaigns or programs or changes to organizational culture, we need objective measures in addition to Net Promoter Score. Some of that involves tech, but most of that involves just having some common sense. People are not as simple as a single metric.